Hello there, my name is Stefan Corteguera, and I'll be presenting along my teammates Benito Fernandez, Emily Gonzalez, and Keandra Payton, and we will be discussing cancer and the environment, more specifically, chemicals and fine particles in air and soil. Starting with our introduction, research establishes that there are more than 200 compounds Americans are exposed to suspected to cause cancer. These include, but are not limited to, cigarette smoke, some solvents, mainly benzene, ultraviolet rays, and ionizing radiation as well, which is usually found in the air, as well as pesticides and radon found more commonly in soils. Exposure to different types of fibers, fine particles, and dust is common in many industrial situations and is linked to an increase of developing cancer. All commercial forms of asbestos, which is a cancerogenic mineral, including asbestos fiber, have been proven to raise the risk of mesothelioma, which we'll be covering later on in our presentation, as long as lung cancer, as well as lung cancer. And the majority of occupational cancers are caused by asbestos exposure, and smokers are the ones that are at most risk. Asbestos has been replaced with ceramic fibers in modern insulating products, and studies have shown that the percentage of asbestos being the highest cause of occupational cancers have been reduced because of this replacement. In industrial and occupational environments such as coal mines, mills, granite quarrying and processing, crushed stones, and related sectors, as well as sandblasting activities, silica dust is present and is linked to an increase of lung cancer in people. Unprotected employees who are often exposed to wood dust from either sanding processes and furniture manufacturing are also known to be a risk of developing cancer.
The incidence of mesothelioma varies across different countries. According to the World Health Organization, the estimated global incidence of mesothelioma is around 40,000 cases, or at least 40,000 cases new per year. The mortality rate. Mesothelioma has a very poor prognosis, and the mortality rates are relatively high. So, meaning mesothelioma isn't really found out about until it's already extremely too late. The number of deaths attributed to the mesothelioma also varies by region, which we do have a graph later on to describe that. And the graph that we're looking at now is the statistical data for cases each year and deaths, along with that, starting from 1980 to projected deaths of 2030. Now, in the United States, the annual number of mesothelioma deaths is estimated to be around 2,500 to 3,000. And we can see that we're between 2010 and 2015. If we are looking at the solid blue line here where it says mesothelioma deaths actual, we can see that there was a spike from the year of 2010 with 2015 from about 2,200 deaths over to well over 2,600 deaths. Now, as we move on to the distribution, we can talk about many different, let me go back. We can talk about first the geographic distribution of mesothelioma. And within that instance, the rates do vary geographically. Um, Countries with a history of heavy asbestos usually tend to have higher rates of mesothelioma. This includes countries, especially like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and other European nations. However, cases of mesothelioma can only occur worldwide due to the large asbestos exposure in certain types of industries. Now, occupational exposure would be one of the biggest things, not just geographic. So, with mesothelioma, it's strongly associated with asbestos exposure. Certain occupations, such as construction, shipyard workers, miners, insulation workers, and certain types of military personnel, are consequently exposed to those types of job related materials, which can cause this certain type of cancer. For example, my stepfather worked in construction since the early 1990s. He was a part of the GL Homes construction when it was predominant in Miami through Broward County and Monroe and all those things. Florida was filled, and many of the buildings were filled with lots of asbestos, and we didn't know at that time some of the long-term effects, or at least we weren't educated on what those long-term effects were and the challenges that we would face as time moved forward. In late 2011, my stepfather lost his memory, and he went under several tests, and it was determined that he had a frontal lobe mass, and it was basically, as we learned over time, that it was due to the occupational exposure and environmental exposures from his job, i.e. asbestos. Environmental exposures that we can move on to now, because I have a firsthand experience with that. As apart from the occupational exposure, individuals can also be exposed to asbestos fibers in the environment that they are in. This can occur near asbestos mines or just anything that contained asbestos materials. This is old buildings and deteriorating insulation that has already had asbestos in it. I.e., from what I said before, when GL Homes first started doing the beautification project to Florida, there were a lot of old buildings that had asbestos in it that needed to basically be done over. So with that beautification project also came many detrimental factors after, as far as workers becoming sick. The latency period between asbestos exposure and the development of mesothelioma is typically long, and it ranges from 20 to 50 years. So going back to my example, and we will later talk about the literature review research comparing to mesothelioma, it definitely took well over 25 years for the development of the cancer in my stepfather, which is comparison to the rate at which mesothelioma can be prognosed or diagnosed. It definitely takes a long time. And with that, the latency period being so long, that's what makes the diagnosis difficult as well as the treatment. Now here is just a brief map to show a larger scale of distribution in the states with mesothelioma. We have at the top here age-adjusted mesothelioma cases and incident rates per 100,000. And then we also see at the bottom the average number of cases diagnosed per year. In the darker red for the bottom map, we have the upper 10th percentile, and those cases are higher in Florida, Texas, California, and in the DC, DMV area. Now, we can say something about that. Florida, Texas, California, and the DMV area are known to have some of the most historic buildings, meaning they have lots of old buildings that have you know, the asbestos particles and dust and everything that contributes to mesothelioma. And over, I would say, at least the last 20 to 50 years, we have gotten rid of most of those buildings and most of the things that would expose us to asbestos. However, we are still just finding out some of the greatest effects of it. Um, and as we look here at the top for the age in adjusted mesothelioma cases, the areas, when you compare them to the diagnosed cases per year, they are actually inverse, meaning the yellow, lower yellow here is not, it's basically inverse to the cases and the age. Now, the distribution of mesothelioma varies across the United States and the regions, and the history of heavy asbestos use or industrial activities have the higher rates of mesothelioma. Some states known to have them, like I said, would include California, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, New York, and the DMV area. These states have significant industrial and manufacturing sectors where asbestos was commonly used in the past. Within these states, there are many variations in the distribution of mesothelioma cases based on factors such as proximity to asbestos mines, the presence of industry that extensively use asbestos during the duration of exposure. And urban areas with a higher concentration of older buildings containing asbestos have a higher prevalence of mesothelioma cases or in less industrialized regions. So lastly, it is just important to note that mesothelioma cases can occur throughout the country as asbestos exposure can happen in various industries and settings. Additionally, due to the long latency period of mesothelioma, cases may arise from exposures that occurred several decades ago.
Hello, my name is Ben Fernandez, and I'm going to be taking over pathogenesis and molecular mechanisms. We decided that with our team about carcinogens on the earth, like air and water, we're going to talk about mesothelioma. So what is mesothelioma? Mesothelioma is a malignant carcinoid of the thin tissue that is surrounding or lining the lung, chest wall, and abdomen. Mesothelium is the name for this tissue, so that's where the name mesothelioma comes from. The main risk factor is asbestos exposure, and 70 to 80% of MM, which is the variation for mesothelioma, is connected to asbestos. The other 20 is about something called SB40 virus. The median survival rate is approximately a year, and the first case was discovered on 1947, and after this, there was a boom of cases because we started using asbestos and these fibers on insulation and construction working. So this is a picture of how mesothelioma looks like. In this healthy lung, we have the lining is perfectly fine. There is no replication, no tumor. Now, in this one, which is mesothelioma tissue, we see that it's not in the lung itself as an organ, but it's surrounding the lung on the lining of it, like this really tissue that is on the lining. There's certain hypotheses, like four hypotheses or the mechanisms of hypothesis on how we can think that asbestos is creating genetic changes in mesothelioma in our cells. So one of them is by reactive oxygen species. So what happens is when asbestos get injected by macrophages, they try to phagocytize it, but because they cannot, it's such a hard fibers, they will overproduce superoxide, and these molecules that are used for optimization and in oxidative birth. And because of this overall like burst of these superoxygens, they're going to attack their own cells and destroy DNA. There's destruction of mitotic process and mitotic spindles. So basically, the fibers get in the middle of metaphase and anaphase, and they don't let the sister chromosomes to be pulled to each side of the cell. So we have some like chromosomal damage. We have absorption and binding of asbestos and main proteins needed for cell circulation. So basically, there is two ways that this can happen. The first one is asbestos, when it comes into our lungs, if it comes like, it's going to bring proteins and it's going to bring molecules that it carries within the surface. These molecules could be hazard to the human body and to the cells, and they can even be extra carcinogenic molecules. And the other one is once they go into the cell and they start binding proteins inside the cell, these proteins could be needed for cell cycle replication or cell like healthy cells replication. So this also causes damage on the cell itself. The last hypothesis is like the release of cytokines and growth hormones or factors by cells. So cells are going to start, like macrophages are going to start coming. They're going to try to attack. They're going to start releasing like cytokines and start releasing growth factors to try to get rid of this substance that is affecting our body. But by doing this, we're going to have inflammation and overexpression of some genes. Now, what about the biological changes? So there's a few then. The first one is growth advantage. So yeah, these cells that are in the tumor, they're gonna have EGF overexpression. They're gonna have transmission factor beta overexpression. They're gonna suppress a lot of other like apoptosis. They're gonna have like an increase in growth genes expressions. Then we're gonna have immortalizations on telomerase. So telomerase shortening is when we stop. It's kind of a way to supervise cell cycle and replication. So when the telomeres don't shorten and they're just gonna keep reproducing. So these cells are gonna have an overexpression of telomerase, and this enzyme stop telomerases from getting shorter. We have absence of tumor suppressors. The main two tumor suppressors that we're gonna discuss today is gonna be P53 and rhinotillostoma. We're gonna have anti-apoptotic mechanisms. So for example, by not having P53, we're gonna start having less amount of P51 too. P21 too. And when we have a small amount of P21, we're not gonna be able to go to the apoptotic cascade, for example. And the last one is angiogenesis activation. Macrophages, N2s and TAMs, they're gonna be overexpressed and they're gonna start creating and releasing PEGF, and this creates angiogenesis. Okay, so this is like a small like a picture of everything that happens in telomerase. So in this cell over here, we see the fibers getting in the middle of metaphase. We see macrophages releasing cytokines and ROS, and ROS coming from the fibers itself. We have inflammation and inflammation markers. We have fibroblasts and then releasing TGF beta. We have cells releasing cytokines, and we have cells releasing BEGF, which creates angiogenesis. Now, this is just a picture that I want to see how it looks in clinically. There's the tumor in the side of the chest, and this is a CT scan of it. You see the black holes in here are supposed to be the lung. This lung is healthy, but when we go to this lung, it's like kind of collapsed by this huge mass that is representing the tumor. Now, we're gonna go a little bit more in deep about molecular mechanisms. So, asbestos particles in the mesothelioma have a lot of changes in molecular bases and genes and proteins overall. So I'm gonna go over three main ones. I wanna go to the cyclin-dependent kinase inhibitor 2A, nephrophromatosis type 2 inactivation, which is Merlin protein, and we're gonna go over BRCA1 inactivation. So let's talk about the cyclin-dependent kinase inhibitor 2A. So we're gonna have first is the most frequently inactivated tumor suppressor on mesothelioma, and what happens here is by suppressing this kinase, we're gonna have a P14 suppression and a P16 suppression. So I will start by P14. In regular cells, P14 is gonna activate P53 by a cascade of substances and reactions, and P53, as we know, is going to put the cell on hold if we have any issue on replication or DNA replication, and we're gonna it's gonna give the cell some time to fix it, or it's gonna activate P51, and P51 will create apoptosis on the cells. Now, when we have no P14, no P53, and no P51, what we're gonna have is an increase of cell replication with damage on the DNA. So with mutations on the DNA, they're just going to keep replicating because there's nothing to put a stop on it. On the other side, we have P16. P16 is really related to CKD4 and cyclin D, which is one of the checkpoints between G1 and S cell in the cell cycle. We know that retinoblastoma is the RB is here, as I be here at the bottom, is one of the stops of these cell cycles. It's what decides if we're gonna checkpoint, we keep going, or we stop right here. Now, if we phosphorylase retinoblastoma, the cell cycle is just gonna keep going, and every cycle is gonna go from G1 to S phase without any hold. And so imagine when we have this P14 and P16 inactivations, we're gonna have a big increase of cell or tumor cells replications. The second one is neurofibromatosis type 2 inactivation, which is the myelin protein. Now, the myelin protein is related to two main pathways, the mTOR pathway and the Hippo pathway. I'm going to start by the mTOR pathway. So the mTOR pathway, through a big amount of substance and reactions, is going to lead to mTORC1 molecule. Now, what is mTORC1? mTORC1 is a molecule that helps with anabolism and creating proteins for the cell. Myelin, as we see here, is a negative regulator of the mTOR pathway. When we have myelin on the cell, the mTOR process cannot go through every time they need it, and mTORC is regularly expressed. If we took myelin out, there is no checkpoint for the mTOR pathway, and we're going to have an overexpression of mTORC1, which create more breaking down of proteins. Now, the other pathway would be Hippo pathway. Hippo pathway. Hippo pathway is made by all these substances SAP1, MST12, MOB, and LATS12. Those are all tumor suppressors. Now, the point of the Hippo pathway is actually an organ regulator. So it creates apoptosis, cell cycle regulation, cell duplication to create like a checkpoint on organ replication. And at the end of the pathway, it also inhibits JAP and TAS molecule. JAP and TAS molecule works in the activations of several pro-oncogenic genes. So when we take myelin out of the equation, we have an activation under expression. What happens is we lose all these anti-tumor genes, and we have now JAP TAS molecules just going around creating more oncogenic genes. So it's like a double the amount of trouble. And the last one is BRCA1. BRCA1 is associated with a lot of pathways that will lead, for example, to DNA repair, transcription regulation, chromatin structure regulator, ubiquitin cycle, cell cycle regulator. Now, when we inactivate BRCA1, we can see DNA repair is not going to be present, transcription regulation is not going to be present, cell cycle regulation is not going to be present, or it's going to be underexpressed. So this creates like the perfect environment for cells, for tumor cells to replicate and create a cell span. And on this picture, it's kind of like a overall mechanism of evidence going on in like the asbestos fibers, like we see on the top, they're going to like the kinase, they're going to EGF, they're going to RAS. So we see like these fibers works like overall on a lot of molecular ways and physical ways and genetics. Like it's like a combination of the three to create this like super malignant tumor, which is mesothelioma.
Okay, so today I will be talking about literature review. We did it on 2 articles. The first article is about the PAHs at an urban site in Wuhan, central China. So this year-long study was conducted in Wuhan, central China from 2014 to 2015, and it focused on monitoring PM 2.5 bound PAHs, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, at an urban site. The average concentrations of PM 2.5s and PAHs over the year were found to be between 106 plus or minus 41.7 and 25.1 plus or minus 14.9, respectively. So the levels of the PM 2.5 bound PAHs increased with worsening air quality, transitioning from good to moderate pollution, but slightly decreased during heavy pollution episodes. PAH composition analysis revealed that the majority consisted of 5-ring, 4-ring, 6-ring, 3-ring, and 2-ring individuals on an annual scale. High concentrations of PM 2.5 and PAHs were observed when wind speeds were high, originating from the same directions, while under stable weather conditions, and they originated from different directions. Source apportionment analysis identified that coal combustion, biomass burning, and petrogenic sources and vehicle emissions as the main contributors to PAHs at the site. The contribution of each site source correlated well with the concentrations of different molecular weight pHs like MMM, LMW, and HMW. PSCF, also known as the potential source contribution function, and CWT, which is conditional weighted trajectory analysis, further confirmed the geographical correlation between pH sources and various molecular weight pHs. Long-range transport from northern and eastern China was found to have a higher contribution than that from southern China, with local areas contributing more than long-range transport. Lastly, the assessment of lung cancer risk indicated that PAHs bound to fine particles posed a moderate health risk to human health care, particularly through vehicle emissions. Now, here in our image, I have a map of exactly where the site was in China. For our second article, the second article is titled Metal Partitioning in Fine Particulate Matter, Assessing Cancer Risk from Inhalation, Ingestion, and Dermal Exposure. So, this article emphasized the importance of studying the relationship between air particulate matter, which are PM concentrations, and their adverse health effects. The penetration of particles into the human respiratory tract depend on their size. Coarse particles are able to deposit into the upper respiratory tract, but fine particles are able to travel deeper into the lungs. Inhaling these said particles has the possibility of causing health effects. The effect depends on the physical and chemical characteristics of the particle, the content of the toxic substances, solubility, total human exposure, and individual health status. Various metals, including arsenic, cadmium, chromium, nickel, and lead, manganese, copper, vanadium, and zinc, are important airborne toxins found in the particulate matter, and they were used for the testing. The toxicity of these metals can lead to organ dysfunction, nervous system disruption, and endocrine system disruption, and DNA mutations as well. So in this study, there was a cancer risk assessment that was conducted in infants, children, and adults in Agra, India, considering their exposure to airborne metals through inhalation, dermal absorption, and ingestion of atmospheric particulates. The concentrations of mobile, bioavailable, water-soluble, and total metals were taken into account. The cancer risks were evaluated using the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which is a human health risk assessment model. Carcinogenic risk, which represents the probability of developing cancer from lifetime exposure to carcinogenic hazards, were also assessed. The acceptable or tolerable risk for the regulatory purposes is between 1 to 10 to the negative 6 and 1 to 10 times 10 to the negative 4th. Carcinogenic risk levels above that upper limit indicate a high probability of developing cancer, while values under the lower limit suggest that there will probably be no significant cancer risk. The cancer risks that we're calculating using equation based on metal concentrations in PM 2.5, ingestion rate, exposure frequency, exposure duration, body weight, averaging time, conversion factor, surface area of the skin in contact with particulates, skin adherence factor, dermal absorption factor, and exposure time. The chemical daily intake, dermal absorbed dose, and exposure concentration were estimated to assess these risks. The parameters used in the calculations were obtained from reports published in the US EPA. By conducting this cancer risk assessment, the study aimed to evaluate the potential health risks associated with the exposure to airborne metals in Agra, India, providing a valuable insight into the likelihood of cancer development in different age groups through various exposure pathways. In this study, the concentrations in Agra, India were analyzed, with chromium being found to have the highest concentration and cadmium having the lowest. Lead was dominant in the highly mobile fraction, while chromium had the highest concentration in other fractions, and cadmium had the lowest concentration fractions across all of them. Cadmium and cobalt showed high bioavailability, while chromium and nickel had low bioavailability. The main exposure pathways for metals except chromium was ingestion, followed by inhalation and dermal contact. arsenic posed as a cancer risk above the acceptable limit for all age groups, with the highest risk observed in children. When considering the bioavailable fractions of metals, the estimated cancer risk decreased. The combined cancer risk from all exposure pathways exceeded the acceptable limit when the total metal concentration was considered, but it reduced to safe levels when considering bioavailable fractions. The higher cancer risks were mainly associated with arsenic and chromium. This study emphasizes the importance of improving the environmental quality to reduce health risks for individuals living near the site in Agra, India. And here in the PowerPoint, I show kind of a graph of the bioavailability of different metals in this area.
In conclusion, there are several chemicals, fine particles, and substances in the air and soil suspected to be carcinogenic. There are many molecular mechanisms triggered by carcinogenic entities of the environment. These substances have the ability to cause gene transcription, DNA damage, and cell death, depending on the organism of the host and the substance itself. But asbestos fiber exposure seems to be the most concerning since they are accounted for the main cause of mesothelioma and the largest percentage of the cause of occupational cancer. The incidence and mortality rates seem to be relatively high. A normal latency period of 20 to 50 years usually separates asbestos exposure from the onset of mesothelioma, and as a result, diagnosis and therapy are difficult. The distribution of mesothelioma cases in the United States can vary across the different states and regions depending on the exposure period, and it was subsequently determined that the expression of proto-oncogenes and the number of signaling pathways that asbestos activated were redox dependent, which explains why antioxidants and antioxidant enzyme concentrations were higher in the lung and pleura after exposure to asbestos, and how they counteracted many of the phenotypic and functional effects of asbestos in vitro or after inhalation. Moreover, our selected peer-reviewed literature highlighted the carcinogenesis and pathogenesis of malignant tumors with the associated cancer risk of inhaling fine particles and chemicals in the air. And these are our references. Thank you so much for listening.